You know, we spend so much of our lives fretting about whether we get the facts straight that we forget to tell the story that really matters to us. Lars Nielsen. One thing I can say about former Mormon Lars Nielsen's new book, How the Book of Mormon Came to Pass, is that he doesn't let the facts get in the way of a good story. In fact, he seems more like a historical fiction writer than a historian. I really wished he would have spent more time getting his facts straight and learning historical methodology, especially source criticism. For me, reading this book was torture. It is rife with factual errors. It is poorly reasoned, and worse, it is inadequately documented. This last item makes the book fraught with mischief, because readers unfamiliar with the sources cannot check many of Nielsen's assertions. Nielsen attempts to advance a new theory about how the Book of Mormon came to be. This new theory is really the old Spalding theory, with an added layer of conspirators and complexity. According to Nielsen, Spalding got the idea to write a history of the 10 tribes in America from one of his Dartmouth professors, John Smith, a gifted and well-published linguist. I found Nielsen's writing style off-putting because it is at times unnecessarily pretentious, overly pedantic, and self-aggrandizing. He is also too wordy, taking too long to get to the point and going off on irrelevant tangents. He likes to begin his irrelevant material with incidentally, which became as tedious to me as the Book of Mormon's And It Came to Pass. But I digress. Probably Nielsen's most egregious time-waster occurs when he fills out paragraphs, pages, even an entire chapter with imaginary or fictional dialogue. He doesn't seem to know the difference between historical reconstruction and historical fiction. Historians sometimes fill gaps with probable reconstructions, but they don't fill them with invented dialogue, and they certainly don't use these gap fillers as major parts of their theory. Indeed, those familiar with historical writing won't recognize this book as such, and what literary quality one might find in Nielsen's writing, unfortunately, didn't transfer to the substance of the book. Without all the fluff, the book would have easily been half the size, making a small monograph or possibly only a long essay. One thing that increased the size of the book was his insistence on examining his new theory within a dreadful 7-part schema, when in reality there is only his favored theory. He admits the others aren't really viable. My viewers will not be any wiser when I inform them that Nielsen is a K sub-5 theorist, and that I am an AK or anti-K sub-1 theorist. Imagine the mess we would create if we did this to every theory. The purpose of my review is to warn the public about this book, that despite its aggressive marketing, it is packed with misinformation and based on extremely problematic sources that aren't documented in footnotes or properly analyzed. For those who unfortunately read it already, perhaps I can help them undo some of the misinformation. The cover features depictions of Athanasius Kircher and Joseph Smith. What does Kircher, a 17th-century German Jesuit scholar and polymath, who published around 40 major works of comparative religion, geology, and medicine, have to do with Joseph Smith? Mormon scholars have been aware of Kircher in relation to Joseph Smith's so-called translation of the Book of Abraham from Egyptian papyri he purchased in 1835, because Kircher, like Smith, pretended to translate Egyptian and compiled an Egyptian alphabet and grammar. Apologists for Smith hoped to find supporting evidence for Smith's translation, but were disappointed in the effort. Instead, they found Kircher had committed academic fraud, a connection they hoped others would not make. Today, he is mentioned only in passing as an example of pre-Champollion supposition and reliance upon centuries-old assumptions, without mentioning fraud. Unlike Joseph Smith, whose translation of real Egyptian papyri came through revelation, Kircher supposedly translated an Arabic document which purportedly contained the secrets to deciphering Egyptian, but never really existed. When Nielsen learned that Kircher had claimed that his sequestered Arabic document was written by Nephi, he concluded that it was a parallel too good to be mere coincidence. Armed with what seemed to be an undeniable Kircherism in the Book of Mormon, Nielsen scoured the text and came up with 5 more. Chapters 1 and 2 are taken up in discussing what Nielsen calls Kircherisms. Without these 6 Kircherisms, he has no book. The problem is, he is so confident and uncritical about the existence of these Kircherisms that he thinks the only issue to resolve is how they got there. Joseph Smith not being a likely source, Nielsen feels justified in speculating about a possible chain of transference, where Solomon Spalding learned about these Kircherisms from Dartmouth professor John Smith and incorporated them in his unpublished manuscript about the 10 tribes of mound builders in ancient America, which Sidney Rigdon procured and passed on to Joseph Smith. In Chapter 1, Nielsen introduces readers to Kircher, and on page 1, he is already talking about Kircher's fictional Rabbi Nephi and his manuscript written in Arabic, containing the key to deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphics. While this is meant to be a shining bauble to draw readers into his theory, it alone cannot sustain the enormous weight Nielsen is about to pile onto it. It also carries with it its own deconstructive implication that Nielsen, in my opinion, doesn't successfully resolve, which is, why would someone, Professor Smith or Spalding, intentionally use a name associated with a well-known historical forgery while creating a forgery themselves? Nielsen senses that there is a problem with Professor Smith and Spalding choosing to name a key character after Kircher's Nephi, because that name would be too revealing of their motives. After all, Nephi was associated with what was widely held to be an imposition on the scholarly community, a historical fraud. So Nielsen has spun an elaborate ad hoc theory that Professor Smith and Spalding intended to eventually expose themselves to teach humankind not to be so gullible. Nielsen must think we're gullible, because this makes no sense. In a long chapter, Chapter 12, devoted to an imaginary conversation between Professor Smith and Spalding, which is nothing but an ad hoc theory on steroids, Smith explains an idea he has for a book that he thinks Solomon should write. At one point, Solomon is made to declare, "So that's why you would make Nephi one of your main characters. He is a clever signal to your fellow linguists that the entire book is indeed fictional." To which the professor responds, "As always, Solomon, you are right on the beam. For the few people who are in the know, Nephi is essentially a synonym for a source that someone made up, but people will believe anyway. As you know, some historians are starting to call this period of history the Great Awakening. Several are putting the writings of George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards above the scriptures themselves. Others are publishing their own revelations, selling them and their souls for a price. Some of them even do so in the style of His Majesty's Bible to make their musings more marketable. No, I don't want to write anything blasphemous, but this story, our story, could inoculate the masses against false scripture, make them believe they are reading an American Bible, and then give them a great awakening. Show them how the human spirit is so easily surprised, and how imposture is sometimes so powerful. That is the real reason why Nephi is in there." So, according to Nielsen, Professor Smith and Spalding conspire to fool the American religious community so they can expose themselves later and teach a lesson. Of course, the danger in doing so would only promote skepticism about the Bible itself, which often happens with former Mormons. It's a lot of trouble to go through with so little payoff. I can't imagine anyone thinking this was a good plan, especially the highly educated. And, yes, it would be considered blasphemous, no matter what their intentions were. This doesn't ring true, showing Nielsen to be neither a good historian nor fiction writer. He never tells us who these authors were who were publishing fake scriptures in the language of the King James Version. Still, it makes no sense to have hidden clues to the deception that no one picked up on until Lars Nielsen came along, if Professor Smith and Spalding intended to expose themselves eventually anyway. The way Nielsen has Professor Smith and Spalding talking about Nephi as the main character reflects the Book of Mormon as we have it now, not how it was originally intended to read. Instead of beginning with I, Nephi, followed by his abridgment of his father's record and a first-person narrative of his own life, originally it probably began with I, Mormon, followed by a third-person narrative about Lehi. As Joseph Smith explained in the preface of the first edition, the manuscript Martin Harris had lost was taken from the Book of Lehi, which was an account abridged from the plates of Lehi by the hand of Mormon. After the loss of the manuscript, this was replaced with a new set of plates, with Nephi abridging his father's record and then supplying his own first-person account of his life. Under the first plan, Nephi was not the prominent character he is now. He is only one of many records to be mentioned in the story. The plates of Mormon, the plates of Lehi, the brass plates, and the plates of Nephi, and so on. As interesting as Kircher's Nephi may be, I think there are better explanations for the appearance of Nephi in the Book of Mormon that are simpler and more direct. Because Nephi describes himself as large in stature, some have suggested that Joseph Smith may have been inspired by the Hebrew word Nephilim, meaning giant, used in the Old Testament and Apocrypha to describe various people as large and strong. Some in Joseph Smith's day believed some of the mound builders were a large people, and Joseph Smith seems to have believed that as well, describing the Jaredite breastplates as large in Mosiah 8, verse 10. The Nephite interpreters, described as 2 stones, which were fastened into 2 rims of a bow, were so large that Joseph Smith said he could only look through one lens at a time. Nephi also appears in the apocryphal book 2 Maccabees 1:36 as a place name. Interestingly, Lehi is also a place name in Judges 15, meaning jawbone. Nephi is short for Nephthar, meaning purification or cleansing. Maccabees recounts that after the return to Jerusalem from the Babylonian captivity and rebuilding of the temple, the prophet Nehemiah searched for the holy fire, which the priest had hidden in a pit, but found only muddy water. When he sprinkled some of this water on the altar, the wood began to burn, and thus the eternal flame was restored to the temple. That Joseph Smith would use 2 place names for his characters shouldn't bother us, for the Book of Mormon is full of place names, which are also names of people. What makes the Nephi reference in Maccabees interesting is that it is followed in the next chapter by a prologue of several verses about abridging records, reminding one of Mormon and Nephi. All these things, I say, being declared by Jason of Cyrene in 5 books, we will essay to abridge in 1 volume. Therefore, to us that have taken upon us this painful labor of abridging, it was not easy, but a matter of sweat and watching, leaving to the author the exact handling of every particular, and laboring to follow the rules of an abridgment. But to use brevity and avoid much laboring of the work is to be granted to him that will make an abridgment. Next, Nielsen tries to compare Joseph Smith's brass and gold plates to brass and copper plates used in producing illustrations in Kircher's books, even suggesting that brass, with enough zinc, can have a lustrous yellow color. Nielsen pushes the comparison even further when he reproduces an illustration from Kircher's book with several portraits of his benefactors, and then tells readers in a caption that they were engraved upon golden brass plates, included in the front matter of Kircher's publications. What does this have to do with the ancients writing on metal plates? It would have been more relevant if Nielsen told us that Kircher's Nephi wrote in Hebrew using Egyptian characters on gold plates, but he can't do that. Again, it is interesting to observe that in 1 Maccabees there is a reference to tables of brass upon which is written the copy of the epistle which the Senate wrote. Joseph Smith's contemporaries knew that the Jews and others in the ancient world wrote on metal and constructed books consisting of metal plates. In the 1823 translation of his book, Biblical Archaeology, German Orientalist Johann Jahn wrote that those ancient books, which were inscribed on tablets of wood, lead, brass, or ivory, were connected together by rings at the back, through which a rod was passed to carry them by. Jahn's Biblical Archaeology wasn't so obscure that W. Phelps couldn't quote from it in 1833. There were also claims of the discovery of metal objects in the North American mounds, including copper plates. In 1823, John Haywood described human bones of a large size and 2 or 3 plates of brass with characters inscribed, resembling letters, found in one West Virginia mound. Most likely, these were hammered, not smelted copper plates, with ornamental designs carved on them. So claiming the ancients wrote on metal plates is not as unique to the Book of Mormon as Nibley once claimed, and some apologists still do. While one can find references to metal plates among Joseph Smith's contemporaries, Nielsen can't manage to find any reference in Kircher, Professor Smith, or Spalding. Calling Nephi's writing on gold plates in the Book of Mormon a Kircherism is a stretch to say the least. Probably, Nielsen's most intriguing Kircherism is his discussion of Kircher's invention of various glass balls filled with mineral oil, within which a spindle mysteriously moved to point out the time, day of week, letters of the alphabet, direction of the wind, or a person's horoscope, which Kircher claimed worked by spiritual magnetism. Nielsen compares this to Lehi's Liahona, a compass-like instrument described as a hollow brass ball of curious workmanship containing 2 spindles, which worked by faith. Kircher's balls had brass parts, but they were not brass balls. And Lehi's brass ball was not filled with mineral oil. Kircher's balls had various functions, but none were used to point out directions of travel, because they didn't work independent of the box on which they sat, which concealed the magnets and mechanism that moved the spindles, as plainly depicted in Kircher's illustrations. In the Book of Mormon, there are 2 spindles, and one pointed the way whither we should go into the wilderness, like a compass. The text even refers to the brass ball as a compass. Alma says, "Our fathers called it Liahona, which is, being interpreted, a compass." Presumably, one spindle pointed to magnetic north, and the other toward the direction of travel. But Lehi's Liahona combined both science and miracle. It worked by faith and stopped working when Lehi's group experienced disharmony. Kircher, according to Nielsen, claimed his spindles worked by spiritual forces, electric forces, and magnetic forces, when actually they worked by hidden magnets, like a magician's stage illusion or parlor trick. Such talk was nothing but misdirection. Joseph Smith was familiar with compasses, of course, but compasses worked independent of faith and righteousness. He was also familiar with mineral or divining rods, and believed in their power to point out the location of water, lost objects, and hidden treasures by some mysterious force that moved the rod in the hands of an adept or magician. So Lehi's curious instrument worked like Joseph Smith Sr.'s divining rod, pointing the way to go according to faith, but it also worked like Joseph Jr.'s seer stone, when writing sometimes appeared on the ball's outer surface. There was writing on Kircher's balls, to be sure, but that writing, such as numbers, letters, or astrological symbols, was permanent. Some have seen possible sources of inspiration in the brass hand-warming balls of Joseph Smith's day, which contained hot coals, and the spherical astrolabe used anciently to navigate the seas. But there is no compelling reason to conclude Lehi's Liahona had anything to do with Kircher's glass balls. Another Kircherism in the Book of Mormon, according to Nielsen, is its mention of reformed Egyptian. Mormon writes, "And now behold, We have written this record according to our knowledge in the characters which are called among us the Reformed Egyptian, being handed down and altered by us according to our manner of speech. Nielsen claims Kircher invented an intermediate Egyptian alphabet with Reformed characters as a precursor to Coptic Egyptian. Nielsen calls this Reformed Egyptian, but as far as I can tell, Kircher never used that term. Kircher's invented characters are no more Reformed Egyptian than anything that came after hieroglyphics, such as Demotic and Hieratic Egyptian. Mormon says the Egyptian characters were reformed by the Nephites, which implies that Nephi didn't write in Reformed Egyptian. Kircher's imaginary Rabbi Nephi also didn't write in Reformed Egyptian. He either wrote in Arabic or Hebrew. In the Book of Mormon, Nephi said his record was written in the language of my father, which consists of the learning of the Jews and the language of the Egyptians. This is usually understood to mean that Nephi wrote in Hebrew with Egyptian characters, although some interpret this to mean that he spoke Hebrew but wrote in the Egyptian language. Whatever the intended meaning is, it attempts to reconcile the Hebrew origin of the American Indians with the discovery of hieroglyphic-like writing among the Maya in Central America and the pictographic rock paintings of the North American Indians. In other words, it was common amongst Joseph Smith's contemporaries to compare Native American spoken language to Hebrew, while at the same time comparing the written language of the Mayans to Egyptian. Some compiled lists of Indian words which seem similar in sound to Hebrew. James Adair claimed, for example, that the Indians called upon Yohewah, which he believed was the Hebrew Yahweh. One of the earliest studies which identified the Indians' language with Hebrew was Roger Williams' A Key into the Language of America, London, 1643. William Penn also compared the Indians' narrow and lofty language to Hebrew, as did Jonathan Edwards in his book Observations on the Language of the Makanihu Indians, published in 1788. Adair, Elias Boudinot, and Ethan Smith all cited the similarity between Indian languages and Hebrew as proof that the Indians were of Hebraic origin. Indian writing, however, observed in North American pictographic rock paintings or petroglyphic rock etchings, Mexican codices, and Mayan glyphs, was often compared to Egyptian rather than Hebrew. On the 1st of June 1827, during the time that Joseph Smith and Emma resided in Manchester with his parents, the Wayne Sentinel published an article titled Deciphering of Hieroglyphics, which compared Mexican glyphs with Egyptian hieroglyphics. This article reported that Gustavus Seaforth, a professor at the University of Leipzig, was studying Coptic glossaries in the Arabic language and a Mexican manuscript in hieroglyphics, from which he infers the Mexicans and the Egyptians had intercourse with each other from the remotest antiquity, and that they had the same system of mythology. The Coptic glossaries in the Arabic language was probably a reference to Kircher's Nephi document. Whenever Egyptian was mentioned, Kircher was invariably brought up. Regardless, it was unnecessary for Joseph Smith to know Latin and read Kircher's writings to make a connection between Egyptian hieroglyphics and the pictographics of North America and glyphic writing of Mexico and Central America. Because it was not unique to Kircher, it is not a Kircherism in the Book of Mormon. Nielsen represents Kircher as believing that the Jesuits had rediscovered the message of Christianity in the hieroglyphic writings of the Aztecs. The words in the quotation marks are not Kircher's, but taken from an internet encyclopedia, which gives no reference to this statement. It is unclear what is meant by rediscovering the Christian message in Aztec hieroglyphic writing, but possibly refers to the tendency of the monks to discover biblical stories in the Aztec and Mexican codices. Nielsen never explains how Kircher arrived at this belief, but in my 1986 book, Indian Origins and the Book of Mormon, I documented speculations among Joseph Smith's contemporaries that the gospel may have been brought to ancient America possibly by one of the apostles, most often identified as Thomas. The gospel had, in very remote times, been already preached in America, wrote Ethan Smith. It is a noted fact that there is far greater analogy between much of the religion of the Indians and Christianity than between that of any other heathen nation on earth and Christianity. Large stone crosses found in Central America were cited as evidence that Christianity had been preached in ancient America. Cortez reported seeing a cross 10 feet high near a temple in Central America. The Indians, he reported, could never know the original, how that God of the cross came amongst them. There is no memory of any preaching of the gospel. Actually, these so-called crosses are stylized or conventionalized world trees, a central element of the religious worship of the Aztec and Maya, who believed that such trees were placed at the 4 cardinal points and another in the center. Belief that the gospel had been brought to ancient America was widely discussed among Joseph Smith's contemporaries, and therefore its appearance in the Book of Mormon is far from being a Kircherism. The 6th and final Kircherism, according to Nielsen, is the name Mormon. The problem with this is that it doesn't even come from Kircher, but rather from an anonymous French author, believed to have been François de la Matre Vogel, who in 1650 published La Parasite, Moment Histoire-Comique, or Mormon the Parasite, a Comic History, which lampooned disgraced French Jesuit Pierre de Monmort, pronounced in French without the T sound, who lost his professorship teaching Greek literature in the College of France because he got caught fabricating sources. Prior to the publication of the satire, Monmort was mocked as a literary parasite because he freely plagiarized ancient writers. Apparently, La Vogel created the name Mormon by transposing the syllables in Monmort's name. Nielsen subsequently admits that the name Mormon isn't a Kircherism after all, but a Monmortism, or rather a Vogelism. So, while it's interesting and worth considering on its own, Vogel's Mormon doesn't belong in Nielsen's list of Kircherisms. Standing on its own, without anything to prop it up, the name Mormon appearing in 17th-century France is no more authoritative than other possible sources Joseph Smith had available to him. In fact, any 19th-century American source is far more likely than Vogler's Mormon, because Nielsen's mode of transmission depends on an elaborate scheme between Professor Smith and Solomon Spalding, which is highly speculative, unsupported, and problematic. Closer to Joseph Smith's environment is the fact that Mormon is both a surname and a first name. It was a rare name, to be sure, and still is, but it's something to consider. Presently, there are 0.11 people with the last name Mormon for every 100,000 Americans. But this can be increased if variations are considered. There are, for example, 0.91 people with the name Mormon, Morman, for every 100,000 Americans. Nielsen should be open to this possibility because in Chapter 8, he tries to debunk the apologists' favorite piece of evidence, which correlates the Book of Mormon's mention of Nahum with a place name in Yemen, by arguing that Nahum was a very common first name between 1800 and 1830. Some in the 19th century suggested that it was a play on anti-Masonic martyr William Morgan's last name, which ties in with the Book of Mormon's warning against Latter-day Secret combinations. Mormon convert Oliver B. Huntington wrote that he met a Mr. Millard in New York in 1843 who said that he knew all about Mormonism and what it sprang from. It sprang from Masonry, or the death of William Morgan, that Morgan was derived from the word Morgan. He said he would prophesy in the name of the Lord Jehovah that Mormonism did spring from the death of Morgan. In 1917, American psychologist Walter F. Prince published Psychological Tests for the Authorship of the Book of Mormon in the American Journal of Psychology, in which he argued that Joseph Smith's obsession with anti-Masonry shows up in his creation of Book of Mormon names. Concerning the name Mormon, he observed that there are not fewer than 25 words which begin with the syllable more, and every one of them is presently followed by the letter N, with either the identical vowel A preceding it or the vowel O. And in popular speech, the pronunciation of O in Mormon and of A in Morgan are practically identical, being quite or nearly equivalent to the short sound of U. Also, precisely as Morgan is the master word of the particular ideational and emotional complex of which we have been speaking, so Mormon, one of the reflected names, is the chief character of the composition, while Mormon is also the name of the composition as a whole. This ideational and emotional complex is the Book of Mormon's preoccupation with secret combinations, destroying both the Nephite and Jaredite nations, and its warning of latter-day secret combinations about to destroy America. Prince included a chart showing the 25 permutations of the name Mormon. Mormon isn't just the name of the editor of the Book of Mormon, but it appears as the name of a Lamanite king, his son, a forest, a land, and a body of water. Incidentally, there are no names beginning with Moore in Spalding's manuscript story. Ultimately, it may be that Joseph Smith simply invented the name Mormon without any specific source of inspiration. After dictating the Book of Mormon and its 188 unique names, Joseph Smith continued to invent names in the Book of Moses and then in his Book of Abraham project, especially in the so-called grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language. So we know Joseph Smith was quite capable of inventing names. The Book of Moses presents us with a parallel to the possible Morgan-Mormon connection. In Moses 5:31, where after describing the secret Masonic-like oath between Satan and Cain, Cain declares, "Truly I am Mahan, the master of this great secret, that I may murder and get gain. Wherefore Cain was called Master Mahan, and he gloried in his wickedness." This is obviously a play on the Masonic degree of Master Mason. The rhyme of Mason Mahan is similar to Morgan Mormon. So again, there are better and simpler explanations for the appearance of Mormon in the Book of Mormon, and therefore it is far from being a Kircherism, or rather a Liahona. By way of summary, what we are really talking about here are two possible 17th-century sources for the names Nephi and Mormon, one from France and the other from Germany. There is no reason to link Kircher's Nephi and Vogel's Mormon, and one doesn't strengthen the other or make their appearance in the Book of Mormon more plausible. Then, as previously mentioned, we have the problem that anyone familiar with La Parasite Mormon would not have used the name as the main character in a pseudepigraphic creation, which led Nielsen to the improbable speculation that Professor Smith and Spalding wanted to be exposed. After a discussion of the possible etymology of the name Mormon, Nielsen admits that there is no hint of Mormon, a venerated general, a righteous prophet, and a dutiful historian, having any attributes of a scarecrow or gargoyle. On the other hand, Morgan Mormon would be consistent with the warning to America to be aware of secret combinations. Nielsen balks at the suggestion that the names Nephi and Mormon are coincidences, but coincidences happen more often than people realize. The law of truly large numbers says that with a large enough sample, many odd coincidences are likely to happen. In other words, with so many data points that the Book of Mormon presents, coincidences, even uncanny and unexplainable ones, should be expected. So, out of the 188 unique names in the Book of Mormon, Nielsen finds two replicated in 17th-century Europe with no probable connection to Joseph Smith. The similarity alone does not justify going to extreme measures to make the connection. The relationship, no matter how tempting, is spurious. Struggling to make the connection, as Nielsen does, seems even less appealing, when we know that both Nephi and Mormon already existed in Joseph Smith's immediate environment, and that more plausible explanations can be made for their appearance in the Book of Mormon? As mentioned, Nephi appears in the Apocrypha as a place name, which is similar to Lehi appearing in the Book of Judges as a place name. Both names therefore appear in many dictionaries of the Bible published before 1830. If we ignore this possible source, which is much closer to Joseph Smith's world than Kircher, and we venture out into the vast pre-1830 world of literary sources with no limits on our imaginations, it is interesting what we can find. For example, did you know that Nephi, with an F, was one of the greatest poets and satirists in Ottoman Turkish literature? Some called him a prophet. Because his writings were often critical of political and governmental leaders, he had many enemies, which led to his execution in 1635. One history of the Ottoman Empire, published in London in 1734, described him in the following words: "There was a famous prophet at Constantinople, in the court of Mohammed Reis Effendi, who was commonly called Nephi Ogli, or the exile's son, because his father had been banished by Kayaprilli Ahmed Pasha, for Nephi signifies an exile, or a banished person. He certainly was the most learned man among the Turks, skilled not only in Arabic, but he also understood Latin. When any difficult matter occurred, it was customary for Rami to consult Nephi Ogli, and carry his opinion to the vizier as his own." Of course, this Nephi with an F is properly pronounced Nephi in Turkish, but so is Kircher's Nephi. I don't think anyone is going to seriously suggest this is where Joseph Smith got the idea for his character Nephi, because it's too remote and would require an elaborate scheme to make it work. Nephi is really Nielsen's only possible Kircherism, but its similarity to the Book of Mormon alone can't prove there is a link. Was Joseph Smith influenced by Kircher or the Apocrypha, or neither? One or both have to be a coincidence. It is far more likely that Kircher is the coincidence. Nielsen includes a complete chapter, chapter 5, dedicated to accusing the late well-known apologist Hugh Nibley and Brigham Young University of trying to buy up all the rare editions of Kircher's books and hiding them away in their safe. Nielsen is sure that it was to keep Kircherisms from being discovered by the public. But Kircher's possible relevance to Mormon studies was hardly a secret, as Nielsen well knows. Egyptologists had already declared as early as 1912 that Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Abraham from Egyptian papyri was a fraud, and compared him to Kircher. If the goal was to buy up all of Kircher's publications and hide them away, Nibley and BYU did a lousy job, since Nibley discussed Kircher in his publications and BYU placed cards in its catalog drawers for anyone to find. Nibley and BYU certainly knew it would be a futile endeavor to try to hide Kircher's works from the public, and to suggest that was a motive, as Nielsen does, is patently absurd. Nielsen notes that Kircher's works were displayed in the university's museum in 1989, but complains, "In neither the booklet nor the display was any variant of Abba Nephi ever mentioned. There is no mention of reformed Egyptian, brass or golden plates, a spiritually magnetic compass, the rediscovered message of Christianity in the hieroglyphic writings of the Aztecs, or any parallel to Smith. As previously discussed, Kircher didn't discuss Reformed Egyptian in a way that connects to the Book of Mormon. He didn't discuss writing on metal plates at all. His invented glass balls were not compasses. Joseph Smith didn't believe, nor does the Book of Mormon claim, that the message of Christianity can be found in Egyptian hieroglyphics in the sense that Kircher meant it. With baseless accusations and weak parallels like these, one must wonder just who is committing academic malpractice, if not dishonesty, which is what Nielsen accused Nibley and BYU of doing. It becomes painfully ironic when, on subsequent pages, Nielsen accuses Nibley of intellectual dishonesty. repeating BYU professor Kent Jackson's criticism that Nibley's Book of Abraham Apologetics exhibited extreme selectivity, lack of precision, misrepresentation of sources, and inconsequential parallels. The irony becomes especially rich when Nielsen concludes, "It is fair to state that once Nibley became deeply exposed to Kircher, he could not help but to emulate him. He Kircherized practically everything he touched. The deciphering of hieroglyphics was his favorite playground, and like Kircher, it was his shortcut to Mormon, if not Faustian, celebrity." After reading Nielsen's book, I have to wonder just who is Kircherizing history with their imaginative and fictitious reconstructions. Just who is trying to take a shortcut to post-Mormon celebrity? In Chapter 6, Nielsen introduces readers to Dartmouth professor of linguistics, John Smith, who he maintains was the true instigator, if not author, of the Book of Mormon, and the likely source for the Kircherisms found therein. However, there is no evidence that a copy of Kircher's 3-volume Oedipus Aegyptiacus existed anywhere in the United States in the lifetime of Professor John Smith. They were not listed in Dartmouth Library's 1809 and 1825 published catalogs. As mentioned, Nielsen's theory is really an add-on to the well-known Spalding theory, which is problematic by itself. Nielsen speculates that Spalding got the idea of creating a pseudepigraphic scripture about the Jews coming to America from Professor Smith while he was attending Dartmouth in the early 1780s, despite the fact that Professor Smith, as quoted by Nielsen, was almost certain that the aboriginal inhabitants of America are not the descendants of the Jews, Christians, or Mohammedans, because no trace of their religion has ever been found among them, nor had they ever heard of the names of Moses, Christ, or Muhammad till after they were acquainted with the Europeans. Instead, he said, it appears very probable to me that this new world was peopled from both Africa and Asia. Nielsen ignores this primary and first-hand source and fixes on a highly questionable article that appeared in the Cleveland Plain Dealer for the 24th of April, 1887, which he misunderstands and then misrepresents as proof that at least one investigator working for a free and independent press concluded almost 150 years ago that Professor Smith and his favorite student were the most original composers, not Joseph Smith, of what eventually became the Book of Mormon. The problem is that the article doesn't say what Nielsen claims. It's not entirely his fault, though. Some of the facts are a bit garbled and confusing. The source of the article was a grandson of Ethan Smith, not John Smith, which Nielsen fails to mention, making it sound like the article was about John Smith. Indeed, the 3-part title of the article indicates that it is about Ethan Smith rather than the professor. The Book of Mormon, a Puritan minister partly responsible for its production. How a congregational clergyman in New England elaborated his theories regarding the lost tribes of Israel in a book, which was never published, and eventually found its way into the hands of Solomon Spalding. Reverend Ethan Smith's semi-historical romance identified with the story as told in the Book of Mormon. So despite the slight garbling, the article is saying that Ethan Smith wrote the manuscript and gave it to Solomon Spalding. The article begins by mentioning a meeting of the RLDS Church, or monogamous Mormons, at Kirtland, and briefly touches on the Spalding theory, then states, Reverend Ethan Smith, who died at an advanced age in the early 40s, was one of the lights of the Congregational Church in New England. A man of deep learning, he was at once a preacher, author, and philosopher, holding to many ideas far in advance of his time. One of his pet hobbies was the belief that the North American Indians were descended from the lost tribes of Israel, who came over to this continent several hundred years before Christ, built great cities, and reached a very high state of civilization. Nielsen doesn't quote this part of the article. Instead, he begins with the next paragraph and implies that it is about Professor John Smith. Reverend Dr. Smith wrote a work on this subject, that is, the belief that the North American Indians were the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, which after completion he decided not to publish, fearing that it might injure his reputation as a theological writer. This book was an elaboration of the theory Dr. Smith had so long maintained. Ethan had an AM, Artium Magister, Master of Arts, not a DD, or Doctor of Divinity. So either the reporter or Ethan's grandson simply incorrectly assumed Ethan was a doctor, or, as some have suggested, they conflated John Smith and Ethan Smith. However, the article never refers to John by name, only Ethan. So it is quite likely that some are reading into the text something that isn't there to create harmony, whereas it is simply a mistake produced by those who had no first-hand knowledge. The article continues to describe the contents of Ethan's fictional manuscript. Taking as its foundation the migration of the lost tribes of Israel to the western continent, it described the Hegira from Palestine, the establishment of the Jews in what is now Central America and Mexico, the founding of a great empire and its gradual decline and fall. While this doesn't fit what we know about Professor Smith, it does fit Ethan Smith's 1823 and 1825 publication of View of the Hebrews, or the theory that the mounds of North America and ancient ruins of Mexico, Central, and South America were the work of a single race of white-skinned Christian agriculturalists who were eventually destroyed in the Great Lakes region by the ancestors of the Indians. Continuing, the article states, Ethan's manuscript book, told of magnificent cities inhabited by an enlightened and Christian people. The author claimed for them a civilization equal to that of Egypt or Jerusalem. Hundreds of years passed, and the history of the Eastern Jews was repeated on the Western continent. Quarrels between the various tribes sprang up, bloody wars were waged, and the process of disintegration began. Gradually, the people were scattered, their cities destroyed, and all semblance to a nation was lost. Thousands perished by the pestilence and the sword, and the remnants of a once mighty nation relapsed into a state of barbarism. Their descendants, Dr. Smith claimed, were Indians of North America and the Aztecs of Mexico. This is almost exactly similar to the story told in the Book of Mormon. As it happens, it is also the story told in View of the Hebrews. The next paragraph is where Nielsen got confused. Solomon Spalding was a warm admirer of Dr. Smith, and when a young man studied under his tuition. This is interpreted as a reference to Professor Smith, because although both were attending Dartmouth at the same time, Ethan, 1 year younger than Solomon, was just entering Dartmouth when Solomon was on his way out. Solomon graduated in 1785, and Ethan followed 5 years later. Well-known Spalding theory advocate Dale Broadhurst writes, because of the probable conflation of facts relating to Dr. John Smith and Reverend Ethan Smith in the article, it is not clear whether Solomon Spalding received a manuscript book from Dartmouth's Professor Smith or from the Dartmouth student and later clergyman Smith. However, most of the rest of the information in the article points to Reverend Ethan Smith as being Spalding's friend and fellow writer of fictional histories of the pre-Columbian Americans. The grandson or reporter may have conflated the two Smiths, but this only pertains to Ethan's relationship to Spalding as teacher and student, and has nothing to do with the claim about the manuscript being given to Spalding. The article clearly states that the manuscript was written by Ethan Smith. Professor John Smith didn't espouse the 10-tribe theory, but it was one of Ethan's pet hobbies. The article continues. He, Spalding, became interested in Ethan's theories regarding the settlement of America and in return Dr. Smith took the young student into his confidence and granted him a perusal of his unpublished book. Spalding was deeply impressed with the truth of this theory and pursued his investigations even farther than Dr. Smith had ventured. Despite what is claimed in this article, Spalding, like Professor Smith, was also not interested in the 10-tribe theory. His manuscript story, which was recovered from Spalding's widow in 1833 by Philastus Hurlbut, gives no hint that he was sympathetic to Ethan Smith's 10-tribe theory and very much inclined towards secular explanations. Continuing, taking the latter's views as expressed in his book, Spalding some years later wrote his famous manuscript Found, which afterwards fell into the hands of Joe Smith and was reconstructed into the Book of Mormon. Indeed, it is not at all unlikely that Dr. Smith's original manuscript, which it is said Spalding had in his possession, suffered a similar fate. At any rate, it has never been seen since. When it says Dr. Smith's original manuscript was in Spalding's possession, it obviously means Ethan Smith, not Professor Smith. It would make no sense for Ethan's grandson to claim Professor Smith's manuscript was in Spalding's possession. How would he know that? Clearly, the article claims the manuscript was written by Ethan Smith and passed on to Spalding, but somehow disappeared. It is also clear that this Ethan Smith theory, as Dale Broadhurst called it, was attempting to piggyback on the Spalding theory, but it never caught on, although it was reprinted in several newspapers in the days and months following April 1887. At the end of the article, the reporter states, "These facts are told to the plain dealer by a grandson of Dr. Smith, now residing in this city." He states that the Book of Mormon differs very slightly as far as its general outline is concerned from the historical romance written by his grandfather 60 or 70 years ago, and is quite certain that the Mormon faith is founded on the production of that worthy pastor's fertile imagination. 60 or 70 years ago would be between 1817 and 1827, after Spalding's death in 1816, and long after Professor Smith's death in 1809, but consistent with the publication of the View of the Hebrews in 1823 and 1825. The grandson or reporter apparently did not know when Spalding died, or when the two men could have met. If they met at Dartmouth, it would have been more than 100 years. Despite being quite certain that the Book of Mormon was based on his grandfather's writings, the grandson's claims may have been based on speculation, prompted by the striking similarity between the Book of Mormon and View of the Hebrews. No doubt Ethan's grandson and other family members, including possibly Ethan himself, who died in 1849, noticed the similarity between the Book of Mormon and View of the Hebrews, and may have formulated their own version of the popular Spalding theory. This family narrative could have evolved through the generations from a speculation into a fact. Nielsen attempts to build the article up as a work of one investigator working for a free and independent press and the report of an investigative journalist, but the article was based on vague hearsay testimony nearly 40 years after Ethan's death. There is no claim that the grandson heard this information directly from his grandfather. The article doesn't even quote the grandson or even name him, but merely cites him as authority. For all we know, the grandson was the invention of the reporter to lend his own speculations more authority. Despite weeks conducting a genealogical search through Ethan Smith's children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, I was unable to locate a probable candidate for the plain dealer's source. Nielsen fails to mention this grandson, although Dale Broadhurst suggested that it was Ethan Sanford Smith, the son of Carlos Sanford Smith, and grandson of Ethan Smith, who, according to Broadhurst, grew up in Summit County, Ohio, and spent his later years in nearby Cleveland. It is true that Ethan Sanford Smith grew up in Summit County, the next county south of Cleveland, but I could find no evidence that he ever lived in Cleveland. In the second edition of his book, Joseph Smith and the Origins of the Book of Mormon, published in 2000, David Presutti said, "The unnamed grandson of Ethan Smith was very probably Ethan Sanford Smith. He was the only Ethan Smith grandson who, as far as I can determine, lived in Ohio. Moreover, he was born in 1839 in Painesville, Ohio, which is not far from Cleveland. His father was Ethan Smith's son, Carlos, who died in the year 1877 in Akron, Ohio, also not far from Cleveland." Again, this is all true, but I soon discovered placing Ethan Sanford Smith in Cleveland in 1887 was extremely doubtful. Ethan Sanford Smith spent his childhood in Talmadge, near Akron, about 45 miles south of Cleveland, where he appears in the 1850 and 1860 censuses with his father. According to his obituary, he graduated from Oberlin and studied law in Washington, D.C., where he was employed in the War Department for several years. Later, he returned to Ohio and about 1872 moved to Minnesota, locating at Little Falls, where he had since lived, excepting a few years residing in New London in Kandiyohi County. He appears in the 1880 and 1900 censuses of Little Falls. I searched the newspapers and found various advertisements for his law practice, showing that he maintained an office in and around Little Falls continuously before and after 1887. He died in Little Falls on the 22nd of July, 1902, of a morphine overdose. This would tend to rule out Ethan Sanford Smith as the grandson who was interviewed in 1887. I similarly ruled out all of Ethan Smith's grandsons and great-grandsons, but none came close or even lived in Ohio. My quest to find the grandson of Ethan Smith, who was the informant of the 1887 Cleveland Plain Dealer article, has brought the claim into question, unless Ethan Sanford Smith or one of his cousins was visiting Cleveland in 1887, and the reporter mistakenly believed he lived there. As it is, the article rests on very shaky ground. If the Plain Dealer reporter didn't simply invent Ethan Smith's grandson to give his own theory some authority, it may be that there was a family story which had gotten garbled along the way. Whatever the case may be, the Plain Dealer article does not support Nielsen's theory. Nielsen gives no hint that the article is really about Ethan Smith. He deletes the title and any part of the article that mentions Ethan Smith. Nielsen claims that he stumbled across the Plain Dealer article while standing in the basement archives of yet another university working on this very chapter. Nielsen may have discovered the Plain Dealer on his own, but he certainly wasn't the first to discover or publish it. I have had this item in my files for decades, and Dale Broadhurst transcribed it for his website of Spalding's sources. Nielsen's quote of the Plain Dealer gives no link to Broadhurst's site, although he provides links to nearly everything else, and mentioned Broadhurst's transcription during an online interview. As far as I can tell, it was first published in recent times by David Presutti, who quoted it in its entirety in his 1985 book, Joseph Smith and the Origins of the Book of Mormon. Unlike Nielsen, however, Presutti understood that the article was about Ethan Smith, not Professor Smith, and he conjectured about how Ethan's manuscript got to Joseph Smith through Oliver Cowdery. Nielsen wonders why the Plain Dealer article hasn't received more attention. He even tries to call out historians for ignoring the article and for not following the trail to Professor Smith and Kircher, like he did. Shame on them for that, he declares with more than a little hubris and cheek. On another page, he chides historians and researchers because none of them have ever suggested that the earliest source text for the Book of Mormon originated with Professor Smith, and none have ever entertained let alone adequately dealt with the presence of Kircherisms in the Book of Mormon. Okay, Lars, listen up. The article hasn't received attention because it claims Ethan Smith, not Professor Smith, wrote a manuscript that was given to Spalding, and no one believes that, not even you. It should now be clear that the heart of Nielsen's theory rests on very shaky ground and should be rejected. So far, we have seen that Nielsen has misinterpreted the Cleveland Plain Dealer to refer to Professor Smith, from which he has asserted that the professor wrote a manuscript about the lost 10 tribes of Israel in America, a theory that the professor rejected. Further, Nielsen has speculated that Professor Smith put Kircherisms into his manuscript, but he can't demonstrate that the professor knew of Kircher or had access to any of his books. We have seen that these 6 Kircherisms are either weak or have better explanations for being in the Book of Mormon. The name Mormon isn't even a Kircherism. Comparing writing on metal plates to printing plates is laughable. Kircher's glass balls were not compasses. Kircher's invented Egyptian script was a precursor to Coptic, making Coptic the reformed Egyptian, if anything. Saying Aztec hieroglyphics contained Christian messages was only a small part of what was believed about Pre-Columbian Christianity in ancient America, which the Book of Mormon tapped into. Finally, the name Nephi in the Book of Mormon has better explanations that do not include the problematic forgery context that Kircher had. Unfortunately, Nielsen uncritically assumed these Kircherisms are in the Book of Mormon, and the remainder of his book is fatally marred by this assumption. In this video, I have only discussed a few key chapters in this very problematic book. Serious errors abound throughout. I will continue my discussion of Nielsen's poor scholarship in a second video. I'm Dan Vogel. Thanks for listening, and see you in part 2.